All right, part two. Here we are again with Ryan. We are going to attempt to transfer his road bike position across onto a mountain bike. Now, obviously a lot of this is not going to transfer across. So this is a bit of a funny topic. This is a hard one. I would never normally take the dimensions off the road bike and replicate them onto the mountain bike, but unless all of the componentry was the same. So if the saddle was exactly the same and the crank length was the same and you had the same stack height, pedal system and all of this sort of stuff, then you can actually transfer a fair bit of it across and tweak it from there. We've got a situation here where Ryan's got two quite different seats, which are similarly shaped, but they are different seats. We've got a Pro Stealth on this bike and a Pro Logo Scratch M5, I think it is, on the road bike. We've also got 5mm different crank lengths. These are 175s, the road bike's 170. And then we've got different shoes with different thicknesses of the sole. They are both Bont shoes, but they both have different effective stack heights, and the cleat system also has a different stack height. Now, you could go out of your mind trying to add these things up and replicate them all across. The best method is to roughly sort of transition the numbers across and then do it by feel if you don't have someone like me there to set it perfectly. So if you've got good sense of your pedal stroke, you should be able to sense when something's wrong on this bike versus the other one. If you set the seat heights the same, for example, and you jump on your mountain bike and you're very clearly sitting higher, you probably want to lower the seat a little bit. So there's definitely going to be an element of feeling this out. But also you can only roughly replicate it given so many different variables. Even little things like the different last on the shoe. So different shoes have different amounts of toe spring, which basically affect the way that the person ankles a lot of the time across the bottom of the stroke, which will then affect your seat height. So this is a bit of a logistical nightmare. We'll run you through some of it and see how we go. The first thing we'll run you through is the different saddles. So let's say, for example, that we've got Ryan's Pro Logo Scratch M5 there, and we've got his Pro Stealth here. One of the metrics that you can measure is what you would call the stack height of the seat, and we're just going to use a pair of calipers essentially from the midsection of the saddle there and measure the vertical height from the bottom of the rail to where your bum would hopefully be roughly sitting, and we're going to get a dimension of 43. We'll measure that one in a minute and put the number in here, and you can then, if the seats have got really different stack heights, you can take that into account when you're measuring the two different positions up. Bear in mind that this is a single one-dimensional measurement here, and the way that the wings taper, where you sit on the seat, how the wings taper this way, it's all going to affect you different, it's going to affect the seat height and the setback effectively. So yeah, lots and lots of logistical problems in doing this. So this has to be, unfortunately, quite a rough starting point. So we'll take his dimensions from his road bike, do a bit of extrapolation, roughly set it and see how close you've got it at the start, mate. So we've got a lucky situation here where these two seats are so similar to each other in shape and vertical dimension, and the padding and everything is so similar that a lot of this is actually going to transition across really, really easily. Even the length of the nose of the seat is really similar compared to where it tapers in the midsection. It's got a very, very similar wing taper, and even the way that the wings drop off on the sides is really, really, really similar. So a lot of these dimensions for the seat height are going to be a lot, and the setback are going to be a lot easier thanks to how similar the two seats are. So that is a huge stroke of luck. So this is measuring a little bit higher than the road bike. This one's measuring out at about 747mm. Ryan's seat height on his road bike is at 742. Now we know that these cranks are 5mm longer. So Ryan's leg is going to be extending deeper through the bottom section of the stroke, which means that his seat will need to be lower to suit the longer cranks. Now these cranks are 5mm longer. That doesn't necessarily mean his seat needs to be 5mm lower. The difference can be anywhere from 5 up to 10, sometimes even 12mm. A lot of it depends on how the person's hamstrings control the bottom of the stroke as the circle that your foot is prescribing in the air changes its size. Some people really lose control of the stroke when they go to a much longer crank, and they need a significantly lower seat height than you would expect. Other people have absolutely no issues with the pedal stroke control when they lengthen the crank, and the difference of the two seat heights is exactly the difference in the two crank lengths. So this could be anywhere from 5 to maybe on the outset, at the biggest dimension, 10mm lower. So this is measuring about 6mm or 5mm, I think, higher at the moment, sorry. So we're going to lower this down a little bit, I suspect, but we'll wait and see what he looks like when he's actually on the bike. Owing to all those factors that we spoke about before, sure this can never be perfectly replicated, but we know we're in the ballpark, so it's not too far off. The next thing we'll measure is the setback. Now, this particular dimension, the dimension of how far the nose of the seat is behind the center of the bottom bracket, this one is one which we would definitely want to alter for the purposes of riding an XC mountain bike versus a road bike. You would know from doing these events over the years, Ryan, it's a very different kettle of fish. There's a lot more short, punchy, sharp efforts. The terrain is massively variable with huge, short, like really short inclines, which are really steep, downhill sections, all of the stuff which you don't really get so much on a road bike. So the variation in the terrain usually means, in my experience, that a high-level XCO rider will want to run the seat higher and further forward than they will on their road bike. For a person of average sort of medium sort of height like you and me, that difference is often more around 10 millimeters of setback. So essentially, if we were using exactly the same seat, we would have it roughly 10 mil further forward and then also higher, because as the seat goes forward, it gets a little bit closer to the crank. So you would need to run the person's pelvis higher and further forward so that they can accommodate the terrain changes as they shift their weight around on the bike to weight the two tires. This becomes a really big deal on a mountain bike, which is not such a big deal on the road bike. So the ability of the rider to shift their weight around is a really big problem. And if we set the seat height and the setback to suit the road bike, you will basically find that the person won't be able to shift their weight forward as well when they go up steep inclines, and they'll constantly feel like they're too far out behind the bottom bracket and the front tire doesn't have enough weight on it. So most XCO riders will want to run the seat higher and further forward than their road bike. And this is another example of why we're not really replicating his position across onto his road bike, unfortunately. Even if we could, with all the different crank lengths and everything, we wouldn't necessarily want to, because we want this bike to pedal differently to that bike. Two different sports. So what do we have? 85 millimeters with the other one. Very similar seat. So we're in luck here. This is slightly embarrassing because Ryan's basically done everything almost perfectly already on this bike. So he's very happy with his general position on this bike, aren't you?
Yeah, it feels great.
Feels great until you fall off it and break your collarbone.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is measuring around 15 or 20 millimeters further forward for the saddle position, and it is measuring around 10 millimeters higher. So I'm guessing when we stick him on this and watch him pedal, he's actually just going to look like a more aggressive version of the pedal stroke that you had on the road bike, which is pretty much exaczly what we want. So let's
like I know what I'm doing.
It's almost like you know what you're doing, mate. I wouldn't have never suspected that with all your years of experience. We have noticed a few issues with the seat. Apparently when you did your collarbone, the seat may have been knocked off square and it's been sitting cocked off pointing to the right for a couple of months while you've been convalescing, and it is actually snapped. So I'm going to give you a spare Pro Stealth that I've got lying around, and there's a good story behind this. This has come all the way from Israel, and Ori, if you're watching this video, Ori, this is your saddle. A customer of mine came all the way from Israel and bought a bag full of saddles which he was having trouble with, and left a bunch of them here as donations, because once we figured out the cause of his problems, we discovered that it wasn't the seat. So he'd gone through hundreds of different seats over the years. I've got a fantastic picture of all of the saddles that he had used, and he's actually left this one here as a donation for, a junior rider like yourself, mate, who might not be able to afford a new saddle. So this one's going to be rehomed. And again, Ori, all the way from Israel, thanks very much, mate. We appreciate your donation.
Thanks, Ori.
All right, so second point of difference, mountain bike versus road bike. One of the big ones is the Q-factor. So a good way of measuring Q-factor, if you're really not sure, because a lot of gravel bikes, for example, have like intermediate Q-factors, road versus mountain bike, they can be somewhere in the middle. Most big dualies like this will have a Q-factor which is roughly 20 millimeters or so wider overall than your road bike. A good way of measuring this, to take everything into account, the spindle length of your pedals, how many washers are under the pedal, whether it's a straight face crank or whatever. What you really want to know is the distance between the center of the bike and the center of the pedal. Now this has got a pair of the Favero MX, they're called, I think, Ryan, the new power pedals from Favero, and the center of the pedal is very straightforward. It's right on the middle of this grub screw, which is basically the disengagement mechanism, adjuster. So what we're going to do is measure from the center of the wheel. Now, luckily this wheel has got spokes which hit straight into the very center of the rim. If they're offset a little bit, you'll need to split the difference. And again, we're not splitting hairs here at such an OCD level that we need to be too worried, but measure from the center of the rim out to the center of that grub screw, to the center of the pedal. And here we're getting a pretty much exactly 140 millimeter length. Now the road bike will measure 127 millimeters almost always in that dimension. Wow. With a 53 millimeter spindle pedal, it'll be between 127 and 129. So these are 13 millimeters wider on each side, which is 26 overall, which is a lot. Now Ryan's QFactor on his shoes, that we've got the cleats centered in their lateral play. So what we're definitely going to choose with these is we're going to choose to run the cleats outboard on the shoe to move your feet closer together so that we can more closely approximate the QFactor of that bike, because we know you don't need this much. If it's grossly too wide, you can actually run into some problems. You can get in a quadricep loading, which is a bit unpleasant. Too much adductor loading, it can decrease your glute engagement, that kind of thing.
Would the wider QFactor on the mountain bike, would that impact my foot numbness at all? So for example, if I don't get it on the mountain bike, but I do get it on the road bike, does that mean wider QFactor is better for me?
It's possible. It's possible. Now, we discussed this in the previous video that you may have a popliteal artery entrapment. It is possible. It is also possible that the much more dynamic position of the mountain bike, where you're up and down and in and out of the saddle and so much variance in the pedal stroke, is what's deloading this. Tough call. That's what we need to figure out with your foot numbness. But that is a really good question, because widening the QFactor will alter all of the angles, particularly around the front of your hip joint. So if your knee chooses to sit outboard a little bit more on this, you are basically increasing the space where the iliac artery runs across the front of the hip joint. And if there is some sort of claudication problem going on in there, you would normally get different symptoms to foot numbness, but it's technically possible that it could relieve it. Yeah.
Interesting.
So Ryan has noticed on this bike that he gets a lot less foot numbness, and we're just trying to nut out what that is. Is it the crank length? We know these are longer, which is the opposite of what I'd expect to help, but it's also probably shorter and taller in the front end, so it's a more upright position. The seat is further forward as well, so the hip angle's more open. And we've also got a situation, of course, where the QFactor is wider on this bike. So yeah, bit of a tricky one. We'll find out in the next couple of months, because we'll do a bit of more experimentation and see what comes out in the wash. So that's a good tip. Keep an eye on the QFactor, and remember you can adjust the QFactor a little bit in the shoe to mitigate some of the massive change that you get on a mountain bike going significantly wider. Now, for some people, you'll actually need to be wider, and this will be a good thing. In Ryan's case, this is actually a bit of a downside, but there's not much we can do, because there's only so much limitation on these. You're going to hit the crank if we move your foot any closer. So we'll see how we go. Yeah, so this is the Form 2-bolt SPD shim system made by Ronin in the UK. It's the only one of its type in the world which is of any use, and it works really well. It's a stackable shim system. We only need 4 millimeters of height. The standard base section is 3 millimeters thick, and then you've got another 1, and then we're going to delete this. That enables it to go up to 5 millimeters, but we're just going to run it at 4 because that's all we need. This requires a tiny bit of modification. These tines which grab through, these pegs which hold it to stop it from rotating, in this configuration, they'll be a tiny little bit too long. So we're actually going to nip a little bit of the length off these just with a pair of side cutters effectively. Take about 2 or 3 millimeters off them. If they're too long, they will protrude through into the shoe and actually poke underneath your foot and cause trouble. So those will grab into the second location that we're not using, and it's just going to sit like that. Yep. So the cleat sits on top, and essentially the cleat needs to be flush with the tread blocks, otherwise you will get no longitudinal stability from the cleat system. So we're going to use these with the shorter screw length. These run a T25 Torx, really high grade stainless steel screws included with the kit. A really good system. It is the only mountain bike shim system worth buying. So yeah, a really, really good piece of gear, this one. Ronin, don't ever stop making these. So Ryan's position on this bike is really, really good. The seat is significantly higher. I think it measures around 10 mil higher, 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 mil higher, and it's significantly further forward, which is around, I think we're around 15 millimeters less seat setback. So his pelvis relative to the crank has basically just moved over the pedals, which for an XCO position, short duration cross-country mountain bike riding, this is pretty much the way to go. Almost every competent mountain biker will prefer their seat higher and further forward, almost like a track pedaling position, and it's because of those short, sharp burst efforts which come with that XCO racing. For maybe XCM, like longer duration stuff, you would be less extreme with this. You would probably you'd probably go back and down a little bit, just so there wasn't as much weight over the front end, but most of it depends upon the terrain, and if the terrain is quite lumpy, you will always want the rider higher and further forward like this. There's one problem with this position, which is the front end. It is unnecessarily short. Now, he's got a 30-degree zip stem on it, which is a heck of a stem. It's got a heck of an angle on it. It's a 100 or a 90 millimeter. It's about 20 mil shorter than I'd like it to be. Basically, what you'll see when you look at his posture on the bike is that when he puts a bit of pressure on the pedals, he wants to drop his torso down between his shoulder blades, and his shoulder blades almost wing and tip up towards the back, which is a dead giveaway that the bar is a little bit too high, but mainly in this case, too short. This will affect your weight distribution, right? So as you go forward, you will weight the front tire a little bit better. It'll also improve your ability when you actually shift your weight, when you get out of the saddle or just in the saddle going around a corner. It'll improve the ability to shift the weight more towards the front when you want to do that specifically. So lengthening it out in your case will just give you a bit better balance of traction to the front tire especially. Won't make any significant difference on the rear, but it will help you load the front tire better in the corners. The other thing that it will help you with is when there's a long straight road and you're just trucking along at threshold levels, you'll be able to get longer and lower. Yeah. the TT mountain bike position, you're not allowed to run skis on these things, are you, mate? I don't think so. But yes, it needs to be a little bit longer. So exactly the same stem or a 17-degree version of the same thing without that spacer underneath, and 20 millimeters longer. So I'm just going to measure this one now. I think it is a 90, and we'll see if we've got a 110 here. We can chuck it on. Let's have a look. So hopefully you can see Ryan's posture change there with the longer stem on. This one is 20 millimeters longer. We've removed a 10 millimeter spacer because this stem has got a little bit less angle on it. So the bar height is practically the same, but it's gone out 2 centimeters, which is quite a big change. And you'll notice his posture doesn't really look that different. You felt it, but it didn't feel long, did it?
No.
It just feels like the weight distribution is a little bit different. Still a big bend in the elbows. You can see as the load goes up, when he puts a bit of an effort in, that his shoulder posture basically stays the same. He drops down a bit, but he doesn't look like he's winging his scapulars to drop his torso down between his shoulder blades. So yeah, a much more normal position. This will potentially have some downsides. So really long stems on mountain bikes like this, they're not really built for 110 millimeter stems. They're built around really short stems, right? So if the steering feels too washy and slow, you might want to meet somewhere in the middle and go down to a 100, right? Yeah. So if you don't get any sense of that and the weight distribution is much better and you can load the front tire better in the corners, it's a win-win. But yeah, going to a really long stem on a mountain bike, you can get a situation where the steering is just too slow. Depends upon the individual rider. My guess is, mate, you'll be so adaptable, you just won't notice. You'll just notice that the bike feels a little bit better when you shift your weight around. Yeah, looks really good. So the saddle position hasn't changed. Ryan's basically got this thing set up beautifully. The seat is higher and further forward. The front end is now set up really well. So we'll mark everything and mate, go and ride it. Let me know if you have any trouble. Looks beautiful. So a good question, which was just asked by Craig behind the camera. Now that we've got a 110 millimeter stem, minus 17 degree on this bike, would you potentially look at sizing the frame up next time? And it would depend individually upon the geometry. We'd have to look at the frame. This is an Orbea Oiz. If anyone knows the pronunciation of that, you let me know. It's OIZ. It's OIZ. So this thing, we would have to check the geometry, because what we don't want is to increase the stack height of the frame. Ryan needs the bar quite low. We've got a 17-degree stem with 0 spaces under it. So if there was a stack change in the frame of more than 10 to 15 millimeters, I'd probably advise against it. But if it's only a 10 millimeter change, potentially sizing the frame up so that you can run a shorter stem could be a good move. It's one of those things which I would always advise the person to go and test ride it with such a long stem on it. Make sure they're okay with the handling. My guess is Ryan will be totally fine with it, but if it's a bit washy, the next one, size up one size, mate, and go to a shorter stem, assuming that the stack isn't significantly taller. Yeah. So there's often some odd, like that you'll see with different mountain bike frames in the same line. The reach changes quite a lot, but the stack height doesn't change a heck of a lot. They're just not as variable as road bikes a lot of the time in terms of the height of the front end. So we'd have to individually check it, but that is a very good question. All right, Rhino, we've finished up here. We've made one significant change to this bike, which is the stem. We've gone 20 mil out. We're going to basically let you go and ride it and see how it feels before we'll change it back if you don't like the way that it steers. My guess is you'll really like it though. So what have we learned from this? Now, extrapolating from a road bike to a mountain bike position, to an XC mountain bike position, because this would be a little bit different if it was an enduro bike and all that sort of stuff. But what have we learned? The seat needs to be higher and further forward, almost always. You're looking for a medium-sized sort of seat height, 750 millimeter odd seat height. You're looking at around 10 millimeters up and around the same forward most of the time. And there's a lot of caveats in there. But assuming that everything else on the bike is the same, the seat needs to be roughly 10 mil higher and roughly 10 mil further forward. You can't really extrapolate anything from the front end, unfortunately, the bars being so different and all that sort of stuff. Forget about that. But for an XCO position, you do want the seat higher and further forward. Take into account the Q factor. It's another takeaway here. The Q factor can be a real big problem for some people, the wider Q factor on these mountain bikes. So always double check the Q factor on your road bike versus the mountain bike. Most of the time you'll see around a 20 to 25 millimeter difference, which was what we saw with yours. And most of the time, therefore, you'll want to use up the lateral play in the SPD or the Crank Brothers or whatever you're using, the pedal system. You'll want to use that up to actually tighten your feet back into the frame, because it's going to be excessively wide. So those are the takeaways. They are very, very different positions in terms of power generation, the short burst efforts that you require on this sort of bike, and thus extrapolation and replication is probably not really what you want to do. So the takeaway is probably don't try and replicate it. Get it in the ballpark, move everything up and forward a little bit, and then feel it out on the trails. Don't be afraid to go a little bit lower in the front end. A lot of these bikes are so upright now with the big travel forks and everything. They're so upright. A lot of the time we spend actually dropping these down with 17 or 25 degree stems when people come in. It's a very common occurrence. So if you're reasonably flexible, don't be afraid to go down in the stem angle and potentially out a little bit. It will affect the weight distribution, and often it's a really good thing for the front end traction on the bike. So yeah, give those things a shot, and hopefully that's of some help when you're setting up your mountain bike from your road bike numbers. Good to see you again, Ryan.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for coming in, man.